The issue of slavery has been discussed in detail in an earlier lecture, but it might be worthwhile to reconsider the issue again in the context of Christian thought. I have in mind the tendency among the early Christian writers to link slavery, coercive government and property together as institutions that result from sin and, somewhat paradoxically, are meant to be sin's cure. The writer known as Ambrosiaster, commenting on Colossians, makes the following points regarding slavery and human nature. 1. Men are created free and equal by God. 2. Slavery is a matter of misfortune. It extends only to man's body. 3. Slavery is the result of sin. And 4. Masters must not treat their slaves with cruelty, but with consideration. In respect of the first point, men are created free and equal by God, Ambrosiaster is completely at one with the Church Fathers. St. Augustine, it will be remembered, noted that God, creating all men equal, had not made man to lord it over other men. This fundamental human equality persists even in the condition of slavery, inasmuch as a man's self or soul cannot be enslaved. This is Ambrosiaster's second point. Slavery is a matter of misfortune extending only to man's body. Given their adherence to Ambrosiaster's first and second points, namely the basic freedom and equality of all men and slavery's being a matter of misfortune, one might expect the Fathers to reject slavery forthwith. This doesn't happen, and the reason for this is that slavery, while not an aspect of man's original condition, is the consequence of sin. This is Ambrosiaster's third point. As the result of sin, man who was once innocent and harmless is now prone to evil, and as such, he requires constraint. Slavery is not only the consequence of sin, it is also in part a remedy for sin. Those who are vicious are in truth better off in subjection to another. As they cannot rule themselves, they may with propriety be ruled by others. Of course, this third point, even if it were true, would prove too much or too little. If, as the second point notes, the slavery of this or that man is in the main a matter of misfortune, there is no way in which any given slave is in that condition as the result of his own misbehavior. So even if it were true that slavery as an institution is rendered possible and necessary for those who are vicious, this wouldn't explain why those who are not vicious are being punished for what they have not done. On the other hand, if all men as such are vicious as the result of sin, then all men, and not just a few, should be enslaved. The third point, human sinfulness, cannot explain why some men are slaves and others are not. This being so, it renders somewhat mysterious the endorsement that the Church Fathers give to the institution of slavery when they posit it as a lawful institution and constantly urge upon the slave the duty of obedience and submission. Caroline notes, the Church then, so far from repudiating the institution of slavery, accepted the fact and framed its own canonical regulations in accordance with it. Ambrosiaster's fourth point, that masters refrain from cruelty and treat their slaves with compassion, does little to undo the damage done by this astonishing and baffling example of conformity by the Church to the norms of the surrounding secular world. Slavery, then, is not man's natural condition and is the result of sin. But slavery is not the only institution that's justified by man's sinfulness. A similar justification is offered for the existence of coercive government, with the same degree of plausibility or implausibility as that offered for slavery. As Carlyle notes, that natural equality which is, in the judgment of the Fathers, contrary to slavery, is also contrary to the subjection of man to man in government. The Fathers are in general agreement that man is naturally social. In this state of nature, men are all free and equal. And while there might well be the exercise of authority of knowledge or skill in such a condition, this authority will not be coercive, but will arise from the nature and uncoerced recognition that some are wiser than others and their counsel should be followed. Coercive government, then, like slavery, is not natural. But, as with slavery, in the actual conditions of human life, it is something useful and even proper. Saints Ambrose, Augustine, Gregory the Great, and Isidore all make the point that coercive government is both a consequence of sin and the remedy for sin. Those who are too foolish to obey the wise must be compelled to do so, for their own good. Slavery and coercive government are then both unnatural to man, but justified by the concrete circumstances of man's life in the post-Edenic condition. However, slavery and coercive government are not the only institutions that are unnatural, but useful and thus justified. The Fathers of the Church in general hold that private property is not in itself something naturally justifiable either. Nature gives all things to all men, and nothing in particular to anyone. However, in the actual conditions of life, private property, like slavery and coercive government, is useful and proper. Carlyle writes, "The Church accepted the institution of property as being in accordance with the actual conditions of life, just as it accepted the institution of slavery or coercive government." This is one area in which the Fathers of the Church diverge sharply from the writings of the Roman jurists. The jurists tended to regard private property in some form or other as being justifiable by natural law. The views of the Fathers represent a tradition which differs materially from that of the jurists, a tradition probably derived from the same sources as the view of Seneca. They would, with Seneca, have classed the institution of property as one of those which belong to the conventions of organized society and not to the primitive conditions of the human race. The position on the authority of a ruler may be set out in the following crude but, I hope, not false way. On the one hand, there are those who take rulership as very much a factual matter. Whatever rulers we have, and whatever their conduct, they are appointed by God and therefore must be obeyed and reverenced. On the other hand, there are those such as Clement who hold that a ruler can be deemed to be appointed by God if and only if that ruler rules according to law with the aim of securing justice. This is a quasi-normative notion. An unjust ruler, on this view of things, would be a ruler de facto, but not de jure. St. Ambrose even goes a little further. Not only must a ruler rule according to law, and for the end of justice, he must also love liberty. If indeed there is a difference between good and bad princes, says Ambrose, it is this, that the good love freedom, the bad slavery. St. Augustine seems to waver between the factual and the normative view of the state. Is a state any organization of rational beings for the promotion of the objects of their love? If so, is that sufficient? Must a state, if it is not to be just a glorified band of robbers, not also promote justice? Isn't this the tenor of the famous passage in The City of God, where Augustine compares a gang of robbers and the coercive power of the state? We find Cassiodorus interpreting Romans 13 in more or less the usual way, but insisting that it is not to any ruler that we owe obedience, but only to the ruler whose commands are just. Wilfrid Parsons writes, Cassiodorus is particularly concerned that the Pauline precept of civil obedience must have, as its correlative, justice in the ruler. Throughout his earlier life, acting as a sort of prime minister to Theodoric, in dozens of letters to minor officials and subject peoples, Cassiodorus unceasingly rings the changes on the absolute necessity of justice in government, if government is to justify its origin in God. Cassiodorus manages to combine this quasi-normative conception of the genuine ruler with the standard late Roman idea that the ruler is both the source of law and above the law, answerable in the end only to God. Carlyle sums up in the following way. We've seen that, with the exception of St. Augustine, they, the Fathers, seem to show the persistence of the conception that the end of the state is the attainment of justice, and that the quality of justice is essential to the legitimacy of any organization of society. We think it important to observe this, for in some measure it seems to counteract that tendency of some of the Christian Fathers towards the theory of the absolute divine authority of the monarch and the consequent obligation of unlimited obedience. Persuaded of the divine origin of secular authority, some of the fathers concluded that all authority under all circumstances was from God, and that even an unjust and oppressive command of the ruler must be obeyed. On the other hand, they were, for the most part, equally clear that the foundation and end of civil society was the attainment of justice, and some of them more or less distinctly apprehended, as a consequence of this principle, that an unjust authority was no authority at all. The person most associated with the notion that the authority of the ruler is somehow sacred is St. Gregory the Great. His view is the culmination of one tendency that can be found in the writings of the Fathers, but it's not the only one. If one wanted to be cynical about this, one could say that the Christian duty to obey his secular ruler is to be heard most prominently whenever the secular power is being used to support some faction in an intra-church dispute. This happened in the case of the Donatist controversy in North Africa. The Donatists, needless to say, protested that church affairs were no concern of the emperor. Those opposed to them, not surprisingly, disagreed. To jump forward 1,000 years or so, we find a similar dynamic during the time of the Reformation. When the secular authorities were on one side, then obedience, absolute and unconditional, is required. When the secular authority was opposed to one's position, then a somewhat less robust theory of obedience was developed. More on this to come below. Carlyle remarks, "Churchmen would resist the emperor when he happened to be opposed to their view, but when he agreed with them, they were only too apt to fall into the habit of regarding his action against their enemies as that of a truly sacred authority." Ambrosiaster expressed an extreme version of the view that the ruler's authority comes from God, inasmuch as God's sanction of a ruler is never lost, regardless of that ruler's conduct. Augustine seems to have held a similar view, on some occasions at least. Nero receives his power through divine providence and under the provisions of Romans 13 must be obeyed and even reverenced. There appears to be a confusion between the descriptive and the normative in the matter of God's sanction for secular rule, a failure to distinguish between what God permits and what God actively endorses. If one believes that God is omnipotent, then naturally all that happens with divine concurrence. That is, it happens with divine permission. It is quite another thing, however, to draw the conclusion that whatever happens with divine permission is therefore proper, just, and right, and is in accord with God's positive will. All sorts of ghastly horrors take place every day, and do so presumably under the guiding hand of providence. It does not follow from this that such activities are morally proper or divinely approved. The possibility that there might be kings of whom God does not approve is suggested by scriptural passages such as, "They have set up kings, but not by me. They have made princes, and I knew it not." Citing this passage from Hosea, Sedulius Scotus can write, "What are impious kings but the greater robbers of the earth, fierce as lions, ravening like wolves? But they are great today and perish tomorrow. And of them God has said, They reign but not by me, they arose as princes, but I knew it not." The passage from Hosea is explained, or explained away, by St. Isidora, who says that what God is doing here is setting an evil ruler over an evil people. St. Gregory agrees with this view of things. A good ruler is God's reward to a good people, an evil ruler God's punishment on an evil people. One might wonder on the Gregorian Isidorian accounts if it's possible to have a good people with an evil ruler, and if not, why not? And if so, how would these fathers account for this situation? Summing up his discussion, Carlyle says, "In Gregory the Great, then, we find this theory of the sacred character of government so developed as to make the ruler in all his actions the representative of God, not merely the representative of God as embodying the sacred ends for which the government of society exists. This conception is, so far as we have seen, almost peculiar to some Christian writers. We have not observed anything that is really parallel to the conception in the legal writers, and even in Seneca and Pliny, we have only indications of an attitude of mind that might be capable of development in this direction. The theory is a somewhat irregular and illogical development of the Christian conception of the divine character of the civil order. For Gregory, God is the ultimate source of authority. For the jurists, the people are the ultimate source of authority. Which party adopts which position depends, to a large extent, on the realpolitik of the day. During the High Middle Ages, we find that the party in support of the emperor is the one that adopts the Gregorian position, while the ecclesiastical party adopts the juristical position. The political theory of the Church Fathers, then, insofar as they have one at all, is the political theory of the surrounding secular world, modified in various respects. The questions arising from the relation of a universal religion to the universal empire were unprecedented, as was the matter of whether and to what extent the character of secular government had divine sanction. But apart from these, everything else is relatively unremarkable. When we come to the 9th century, however, we enter a different world of political thought. Just as there is a break between the ancient world and the world of the Roman lawyers, centered on their differing conceptions of man, so too, as we come to the end of the first millennium, we leave the classical world firmly behind and move towards a world that is recognizably modern, if only in a rudimentary way. Carlyle notes, "There's a great gulf between the Teutonic societies of the Middle Ages and the ancient empire, but there are many relations, many traditions which have been carried over from the one to the other." The contribution of these new thinkers to political theory arises from their attempt to reflectively appropriate and to express the principles embodied in the legal and political practices of their quasi-tribal societies. On one point, however, namely that of slavery, the approach of the 9th century thinkers doesn't differ appreciably from that of the earlier period, save that it is, if anything, slightly harsher. One writer, Smaragdus of St. Mihiel, differs somewhat from the common view in urging rulers to prohibit the making of any new slaves in their territories, and slave owners to manumit their slaves, but even he stops short of recommending outright abolition. The 9th century inherits the Roman and patristic teaching on the divine source of secular authority, and the corresponding obligation on Christians to offer no resistance to their rulers, and to obey them in all things save a direct command to violate God's laws. This inherited tradition comes into a sharp conflict with the indigenous beliefs and practices of the Germanic tribes, one significant aspect of which is that the authority of rulers is limited and the obligation of obedience to that authority is conditional. The clash between these two theoretical tectonic plates is a source of much of the apparently confused political discussions and political practices of this period and the following centuries. The doctrine of unqualified and passive obedience to one's rulers got a shock when civilized Roman churchmen found themselves under the power of rude and ignorant tribal chiefs. Once again, the clash of theory and practice leads to a reconsideration of theory. More to the point, however, is that the traditions of the Germanic tribes were innocent of any subscription to the theory of unlimited and absolute obedience to one's rulers. The Teutonic tradition knew nothing of an unlimited authority in the ruler, writes Carlyle, but a great deal of the relation of the king to his great or wise men, and even to the nation as a whole. For the most part, the churchmen outside of Italy, and even to a large extent in Italy, were men of the Teutonic race or tradition. For the 9th century thinkers, a king without justice was no king, but a tyrant. The law is the law of the community, and the king, as part of the community, is as bound by that law as anyone else. The law is not a matter of the king's will. So far as laws have been made, they proceed from the whole state. They have, says Carlyle, been made with the general consent of the faithful subjects of the king. The king does not make laws by his own authority, but requires the consent and advice of his wise men and, in some more or less vague sense, of the whole nation. The law of the 9th century was made up of the following elements: traditional tribal law, the remnants of Roman law, and the new laws or amendments of the old laws made with the consent of the people. A new element, canon law or the law of the Church, makes its appearance at first fitfully, and then with ever greater force. The political theory of the 9th century, then, very clearly recognizes that there is an authority in the Church which extends over all persons, even the most exalted in society. There is, then, a body of law in the Church which all men must obey and to which all other laws must conform themselves. In the 9th century, kings came to be kings by a process that to us appears confused, if not downright incoherent. The process combined elements of divine sanction, election, and hereditary succession, elements that might well appear to be incompatible and even contradictory. The election element in this process is of great interest to those of us keeping an eye on liberty. Perhaps of even greater interest is that in this process of election there was a mutual exchange of promises between king and people, or at least between king and the great men in the land. This makes the kingly appointment both contractual and conditional. In the early 9th century, relations between the secular and ecclesiastical powers were weighted heavily in favour of the secular. Within 200 years, however, this balance was going to shift dramatically. Although the two powers were in principle separate, in practice they intermingled. One area in which the secular authorities influenced church matters greatly was in the appointment of ecclesiastics, especially the greater ecclesiastics. This practice was going to be the focus of attention in the following years.